I'm so excited to be giving this presentation to you. I see familiar faces and also new faces. This is my favorite information to talk about. I've talked about it a lot, and my goal is that you'll come out of this with useful information that hopefully you will remember for years to come, you know, in how you kind of form and maintain your romantic relationships. And so I'm going to be talking for a while, and then there'll be a chance to do some, take about 10 minutes, and you can do some online attachment style questionnaires that I'll guide you to. Then we can kind of talk about what that means. So there's going to be, I think, lots of interesting stuff here. And if you're coming in, just take your time. It's totally fine. Okay, so let me, here's my Kahoot, except I'm not used to doing Kahoot. So let me get it up here and get it going. Okay. Okay, so there's the game pin. Okay, so we'll let it go for a little bit here while people are joining. Maybe while people are getting joined, I'll tell you what we're going to talk about, and then I'll come back to my first Kahoot questions, okay? So I'll give you a chance to join. So this is what you can expect that we're going to cover. First, I'm just going to kind of give a sense of how attachment is a lifespan need and behavior, and I'll talk a little bit about the neurobiology of attachment. Do you still need the game pin? That wasn't very smart, right? Yeah, okay. Then I'm going to talk about forming a romantic attachment. Then I'm going to cover attachment styles in childhood and adulthood, talk really quickly about attachment and sexuality, and then I'll talk about strategies. But let me get back to that game pen for you. Okay. I'll let this run for a little bit more. Okay, wave if you need more time. All right, so let's start, and I'll do these first couple of questions, all right? And the game pin's still at the bottom. Okay, so here's the first one, and it gives you 20 seconds. Wow, you all are fast at this. Okay, so here's our results. We've got about a quarter of the class, turn my mic up, thanks for telling me. About a quarter of the class is here with, on their own, solo. About close to half the class is here with a friend, 20% with a partner, and maybe a little under 10% with a family member. So welcome to everybody. Let's get our next question. And I'm Ashley, so that'd be like if you've learned about it from me in another class. How's the sound now? Is it better? Still too quiet? You're doing okay? Okay. Okay, so we can see that we're about a third, a third, a third. Some people have learned about it other places, some people haven't learned about it, and some people have heard a lot of what I'm going to say, but you've brought someone that you're hoping will hear this information too. All right, great. So we'll come back to our Kahoot questions in another handful of slides. Okay, so let's get started on that first part, lifespan attachment behaviors in neurobiology. So if you've heard about attachment before or learned about it before, the primary way that we often hear about it and talk about it is with parents and kids, right? Or babies and parents and caregivers. And so the point that we're going to be making throughout this presentation is that attachment isn't just for, you know, parents and caregivers. Attachment seems to be kind of hardwired into our DNA. We are oriented to connect with other people. We're social creatures, and it seems to be that way, you know, throughout our lives. And one of the points I'll be making as we go is that the need for attachment connection and kind of our fear when attachment is disrupted are powerful forces that often kind of drive our behavior, even though we're not always conscious of it. So let me just tell you a little bit more about neurobiology and how our attachment systems and our fear systems are intertwined. So basically, when we experience a threat, and so we'll just go with a general threat up there first, like let's imagine that I got some negative feedback at my job, my fear system turns on, right? And I start, my amygdala starts firing up, danger, danger, you're in trouble, right? It turns on my HPA axis, that hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, cortisol and adrenaline start going. My sympathetic nervous system, that fight or flight, gets riled up, essentially. And if during that time I reach out to someone who's an attachment figure for me, like maybe for me that would be my husband, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this just happened at work, I'm going to lose my job, I'm freaking out. If my husband and I have kind of a good attachment bond, then he can say, it's going to be okay, it's probably not that big of a deal, you don't need to freak out. And that will down-regulate my fear system. My attachment system will turn on, my oxytocin will start firing, and that will down-regulate my amygdala, my HPA axis, and my sympathetic nervous system. Interestingly, if I couldn't reach out to a supportive person, and I was just trying to, be strong and tough through the day, my body would start releasing oxytocin so that I wanted to just bond with the people around me. If there's studies where if people just sniff oxytocin, they just want to hug other people, right? So my body would start releasing oxytocin so that then I would just turn to a colleague in the hall, oh my gosh, you wouldn't believe what happened to me today, right? Which is why we, under stress, can really kind of reach out to other people and bond with people during stressful times. So that's kind of interesting that our bodies, when we are under stress, are going to be priming ourselves to try to connect with other people whether we want to or not. Now, the interesting thing also is that what happens when our partner is a source of threat? And certainly our partners could be like a scary source of threat, like we've been struggling with violence in our relationship, but most of the time our partners aren't in that way a source of threat, but they're a source of threat because we were hoping for a better, more supportive response from them, and they're rolling their eyes or making a huffy sound or ignoring us. And now our attachment system, or our fear system's going off because our partner we're perceiving them as a source of threat because they're not getting us, right? And that's what I think creates the big challenge in romantic relationships, is because now you've got this competing urges. You've got your fear system is amping up because your partner isn't getting you, and it wants to prime you to connect to this person so that you can calm down, but now they're not, making you feel better, and so you've got all this kind of, incongruent emotion, right, about them in this tension. Like, you're supposed to be helping me, but you're not, right? And so that's why I think it's so challenging to navigate things in our romantic relationships. Okay, so that's just a quick overview of neurobiology, and now we're going to talk more about the process of how we form romantic relationships. And so there's generally 3 steps in adult romantic relationships: pre-attachment, attachment in the making, and what's called clear-cut attachment. And I've got a slide for each of those. So pre-attachment is kind of like flirting or dating. So this is where you've met someone, you think they might be a potential partner for you. You're starting to create a little file folder for them in your mind, right? You've put their name on it, and you're starting to gather information about them and put it in there. You've created a mental representation of them, of your kind of initial impressions. If things are going well, you might start to get those infatuated feelings, right? Where dopamine is a big rush during this time. You're finding their face really attractive. That helps you release more dopamine. You're excited to see them. That makes you release dopamine. But at the same time, parts of your brain that are associated with anxiety and your body are associated with anxiety are also firing up. So this is why in the beginning you might feel like just sweaty or jittery or out of breath or, shaky. When my husband and I had our first kiss 27 years ago, we were both shaking so badly it was embarrassing, right? Because, it was just like the intensity of the moment. Something else that can happen in the pre-attachment stage is called mate guarding. This is where you basically tell your friends, back off, he or she is mine, right? So that happens too. And I always say that this is why this is what basically got my husband off the couch to date me. I was pursuing him. He was kind of like, whatever, not showing that much interest. But then his roommate said, hey, if you're not going to ask Ashley out, I'm going to ask her out. And suddenly that like fired up his mate guarding instinct, and she, like, no, I'm going to ask her. She's like, she's mine. I'm going to ask her out, right? And I'm always like, thank goodness for Mike, right? Otherwise, who knows if we'd be here today. Mike was the best man in our wedding, by the way. So it was great that he kind of got things going for us. Okay, so then now we move on to attachment in the making. So this is where we start to spend a higher amount of time with the person, and we have kind of a better quality of time with the person. And interestingly, I worked with a graduate student a few years ago interviewing undergrads about how they formed relationships. And even though we have all this technology, right, and we can communicate through text and Skype and FaceTime and Snapchat or all these things, the themes when people talked about forming relationships were still more time together and kind of higher quality of time together. And quality can look like we are starting to disclose more personal information about ourselves, and we're going to talk about how we vary in that too. Some people are doing that more, some people are doing that less, right? We're starting to disclose more and maybe build up some trust. We often do more fun things together in the beginning parts of a relationship, right? We might watch the sunset, we might bake cookies, we might go on a road trip, we might just do kind of different and crazy things. 2 years in, everybody's just watching Netflix. But in the beginning, right, you're doing these kind of more novel or exciting things. And then we also start to turn to this person a little bit when we're in distress and see how it goes and see how they handle it. And I'm going to talk about the distress relief dynamic a little bit more on the next slide. Here in the pre-attach or in the attachment in the making stage, they're probably not our number one person that we go to when we're in distress. You've still got your number one person, you know, whether that's your best friend or your mom or your dad or brother, sister, somebody that you turn to. But you're starting to use this person as a secondary attachment figure when you're in distress and to kind of see if they can be of support. If you're the exclusive type, this is when you might start being exclusive. And this is also when it might start to get hard to be apart, right? Oh, I don't want to say, I don't want to be gone. I don't want to be apart from you for the holiday or weekend or a trip or stuff like that. So this is the distress relief dynamic. And Bex and Cohn theorized that this is basically how attachments form, for better or for worse, both in childhood and in adulthood. So we'll start with just a baby. A baby is experiencing some distress. Hopefully they have a caregiver that at least most of the time can give them support, help them feel some relief, right? And then that cycle repeats itself. And if that is generally going well, right, I turn to you when I'm in distress, you provide me some support, I feel relief, then that's the making of a secure attachment. It doesn't have to be perfect, but we're trying to get at that a lot of the time. So same idea in our romantic relationships. I'm in distress, I turn to you, I'm hoping for some support and some relief. If I'm getting that, then generally that kind of helps further our relationship, helps keep it going. If I keep turning to you when I'm in distress and I'm not getting support, or vice versa, I can't provide you with support when you're in distress, then we might not stay with that person, right? Or this can be what happens when relationships start to break down later. Maybe we were doing well for a while in this distress support relief dynamic, but now we've been fighting a lot and we're not able to kind of support each other and bring relief. But so hopefully with attachment formation, this is going well. And then we move into clear-cut attachment, and this is where we can experience some relief, distress relief, without even necessarily having to have that person right in front of us or be talking to that person. So if I go back to that example about something stressful happens in my day, now that I've been with my husband for so many years, right, I can just imagine what he would say to me. It's probably not that big of a deal. It's going to be okay, right? I can imagine the conversation that we're going to have later. I can kind of hear his voice in my head, and that will calm my system down. And you all already have people like this. We all have kind of I think of them as like my safety net people. Like I'm a trampoline or a trapeze artist, right? And they are my kind of safety net that you kind of could talk you off the ledge when you're freaking out, and just knowing that they're there for you helps you calm yourself down. And so oftentimes when we move into clear-cut attachment, which, and you're kind of wondering about the timing of this, I mean, generally this is more like closer to years than months or weeks, right? Some people move really quickly through this, but generally we think about this more like a couple of years before we might move into more someone being kind of a clear-cut attachment figure. So then by the time we get to this point, a lot of those kind of lovely cocktails of infatuation have died down a little bit, and we might not have kind of the intense, passion of the beginning, and more kind of a sense of security and kind of calm connection. Still that separation distress, not wanting to be apart, right? And maybe some serious commitment. Okay. So then how did we get ourselves from childhood to adulthood with our attachment styles, and how are we maybe different in some ways? So how we form attachment security with our initial caregivers, and we could, by the way, have a different attachment style with one caregiver than another, but generally how that happens is we talk a lot about that middle one, the caregiver attunement, that if a caregiver is kind of providing distress relief, if they're responsive and sensitive, right, then you're going to have more attachment security. But there's also these other factors of how much stress is happening in the environment. So it's a lot easier for me to be supportive to anybody if I'm not incredibly stressed in my environment. But if I've got high environmental stress, that gets harder for me to be, a caregiver who's sensitive and responsive. And then the other factor is what's called differential susceptibility, which is basically how sensitive is this child to the environment. And there's increasing research coming out that some of us have more genes to be more plastic or sensitive to the environment, for better or for worse. And so these kids, the kids who aren't very sensitive, right, they could have a caregiver who's not always that attuned, an environment that's more stressful, and it just doesn't bother them that much. They're what we call the dandelion kids. But then there's kids who are more sensitive. They're called the orchid kids. And so they're really in tune to what's happening in the environment and what's happening with their caregiver. And so if things aren't so stressful and their caregiver is really responsive, then they're going to form a secure attachment. They're going to be doing great. But if the environment's more stressful and their caregiver is having a harder time being in tune, then they're more at risk to have an insecure attachment because they're just more sensitive to the bad stuff too, if that makes sense. Okay, so either way, that's kind of a quick, like you have some kind of attachment security from childhood, and some of us in here got the good stuff, and some of us got the short end of the stick. We don't have really any control over that. And so you bring that attachment security into the rest of your life, and it begins to kind of influence how your body regulates itself, how it responds to stress. Generally, kids, those of us who got lucky and got more attachment security, have an easier time kind of regulating emotions and managing stress than those of us who didn't get it, or didn't get enough of it. And then that, of course, predicts how well we're going to do in kind of forming relationships and creating kind of attachment later on in life. Okay. So related to this is John Bowlby's work on internal working models, which basically says from our earliest relationships, we begin to kind of form a working model of ourself and of others. And if generally things were pretty safe and people were pretty responsive when we were growing up, then we start to believe that we are, for the most part, lovable, right? And for the most part, we can count on other people. And I've never met anybody who has a perfect internal working model, of self and other. It's like, oh, no issues here, no fears about myself, no fears about other people. We've all got, fears in our internal working models. But some of us, what I notice is that sometimes people have more kind of fears about themselves, and sometimes people have more fears about others. And I used to pay attention to this, when I was actively being a therapist and listening to people talk about, a problem. Sometimes they were talking more about like, oh, and I feel so terrible because I didn't handle, it's more about me. And sometimes they're like, those jerks, it's more about them, right? So let me do a next Kahoot here on which internal working model do you struggle with more? Working model of self or working model of other? Let me get my Kahoot up here. All right, next one. Okay, so we can see our overall there. About 40% saying internal working model of self, about a quarter saying others, another quarter saying both, and about 12% couldn't decide. So the idea is we begin to carry these internal working models with us into our future relationships, and a lot of times these kind of become self-fulfilling prophecies. So if I have struggles with my internal working model of self and I worry that I'm not good enough, one thing that might happen in my relationships is I can come off as a little too clingy, a little too insecure, and I can end up pushing other people away, which then just confirms for me that there's something wrong with me, right? Or if I struggle more with my internal working model of others, then I might, for example, hold my cards really close to my chest, not disclose a lot about myself to somebody else, and then suddenly they find out I haven't told them something kind of important. They feel like, gosh, I don't matter to you that much. They feel a little bit betrayed, right? They get mad at me, which then just confirms that I can't trust other people, right? So we often carry these forward and end up kind of creating the same kind of thing in our future relationships. And so we will talk about attachment both as what's called a trait, like something that you develop early on and you carry across your relationships. But we can also, there's also evidence to talk about attachment as a state, meaning it just describes my attachment connection with any one person at any one point in time. So maybe my attachment connection with my mom was insecure for some years, but it's secure now, right? Or maybe my attachment style with my dad was secure, but my attachment style with my mom was insecure. And so if we got an insecure start in life, there's always this path, what's called earned secure, where you start to kind of gain more self-awareness about your attachment style and behaviors, and you begin to kind of change how you're interacting with people to create kind of more attachment security. So the good news is even if we didn't get started with it, it's always a possibility for us. So when we talk about attachment and individual differences, we, in the adult attachment literature, they basically talk about two continua. The amount of attachment-related avoidance you have, so how much do you deactivate, minimize, or shut down when in distress, and the amount of attachment-related anxiety that you have, how much do you maximize, amp up, or hyperactivate when you are in distress. And people can be high on one and low on the other. They could be high on both, or they could be low on both. Generally, when we think about secure attachment, we've all got some of this, right? But we are lower, we're trying to be lower on the amount that we are amping up or shutting down. And so I'll talk more about these. So then these two continua overlap in these quadrants to form four attachment styles. So in the attachment style literature, they talk about it in the amount of attachment-related anxiety and avoidance, but then they also talk about it in these four categories. So the two questionnaires that you're going to fill out are going to get at both of these a little bit. And so you can see if you were high on avoidance and low on anxiety, that would be more what we would call an avoidant attachment style. If you're low on avoidance and high on anxiety, that's more what's called, we tend to just say anxious, even though it's also called preoccupied. If you're low on both, that's secure, and if you're high on both, that's more fearful avoidant. And I'll describe all of these for you. But what I want us to do now is just get a sense. I want to take, we might not go a full 10 minutes, we might do like 8 or 9 minutes, just because we got a little bit of a late start. I want you to do one or both of these if you have time, these tests. And so this test, the relationship structures test, asks you 9 questions about a mother figure, father figure, friend, and romantic figure, and it's going to plot 4 data points for you on this graph. And then this quiz is associated with this book that I recommend called The Attached, where you can take a compatibility quiz and answer questions about yourself and your partner and kind of get a sense of how much you might struggle to form a secure attachment. Okay, so let's get going on it. And obviously it's optional, so you could choose to chill out or choose to come chat with me if you wanted to instead. But this is kind of a chance to use a device, do some of these, and then in a little bit here I'll ask you, through Kahoot what your experience was. Okay? And I'll just wave me down if you want to ask any questions. And, I should say. I should say that you are welcome to chat with each other during this time as you're finding things out, so don't feel like you have to be totally quiet, okay? We're going to take about 2 more minutes, so you can always come back and finish it up later too. Okay, so, as you're ready, I'm going to start the Kahoot for the next question. So if you did the one where it gave you 4 kind of quadrants based on 4 relationships, was your attachment style similar or different across the 4 relationships? And that was the first test. And you can also say I didn't do it if you didn't. Okay, for the people who were able to answer, it looked like it was evenly split. About half the people who did it were saying mostly or all the same, and about half saying mostly different. So that really tells us about how attachment can be both like a trait, where we can be similar across relationships, but attachment can also be like a state. It can really vary across relationships. So it can be both. Okay, and then here's a question. How surprised were you by any of your results? And so as this is coming in, the point I want to make is if you, when you filled this out, the results you got say that you have more of an insecure attachment style, or you're more higher on avoidance or anxiety, or your partner is, I don't want anybody to like freak out and think you're doomed, because we all have some of this, and sometimes we do have more of it, or our partner has more of it, but just to gaining kind of awareness about it in ourselves, right, and in our partner gives us kind of a starting point for thinking about how to make some shifts so that we can be more successful. And I can assure you that whatever your attachment style is, you're not alone. There are other people in here who are, very similar to you. Okay, so about half saying not surprised, and then some people saying mixed or a little bit surprised. Okay, so I'll keep moving here, and I'm hoping we'll have time for questions at the end, either large group or one-on-one. All right, so here's some slides, and I think these are really fun about the attachments, how these attachment styles look in dating relationships. So those of us who are higher on attachment-related anxiety, and that would be me, if I would go in one direction towards avoidance and anxiety, I would go more towards attachment-related anxiety. So we tend to, when we're forming a relationship with someone, we tend to ruminate about rejection. We kind of are focused on wanting to get our needs met, and is this person going to be the right person for us? We can come off as really wanting closeness. We can come across as being a little too needy or a little too overeager. I find this interesting. This definitely describes me. We can share too much negative information about ourselves too soon. I call this confessing, like, here, let me just tell you all my flaws, right in the beginning. We can overestimate the similarity. Oh, she and I are so similar. Or he and I, we've got so much in common. And I think we all do that to some extent. But those of us who have more attachment-related anxiety do a little bit more of that. And in that balance between independent and dependent, we can hang a little bit more towards dependent. We might hope that, our partners, we don't have to tell them everything. They could just kind of meet our needs, read our minds. We can interpret things about that aren't about us. Like, you're late, that means you're not that into me, right? You didn't call me, that means you don't like me, right? We can kind of make it about us. We can be more suspicious that our partner maybe isn't being faithful to us. And we can sometimes be game playing or trying to play it cooler than we actually feel, to try to kind of keep our partner's interest. If we have higher attachment-related avoidance, then we tend to come across as more aloof, right, or detached. We don't disclose as much about ourselves early on. We aren't as attentive when our partners are disclosing that much. We are thinking more about our independence and not wanting to sacrifice that. We don't show as much commitment. We might also come across as game playing, sending kind of mixed signals. Your partner can't get a sense of how into you are, right? They just can't tell. Might kind of do a little bit of mean teasing to kind of distance, right? Push your partner away a little bit. Worrying that your partner might take financial advantage, not wanting to talk on the phone, even if that's the main way you have to connect, struggling to hang in there during conflict, wanting to kind of get away. Partner kind of is guessing about how much what your plans are for the relationship, and you're not really loving talking about the relationship. Now, if we are more secure, and I find this if I was in a dating relationship or trying to be in a dating relationship, I think I'd just be looking at this list. Okay, let me try to do these things, right? They're not necessarily my inclination, but I'm going to try to be this way. We are fairly reliable and consistent in kind of making plans and contacting the other person, that we can make decisions with our partner, that we're kind of flexible about the relationship. I'm into you, I'm open to seeing where it goes, but we can kind of see where it ends up. I'm not kind of holding on so tightly that I'm going to die if this relationship ends, but I'm not not taking it seriously either. We can generally maybe talk if something's bothering us. If our partner is bothered, we want to understand maybe where they're coming from, and if we are in conflict, we're not just out to win. We're out to create some understanding. We're less worried about losing freedom, although I think that's a normal fear no matter what. When we're close, we don't have to then, not that we can be close 24/7, but that doesn't mean once we've had a moment of closeness, I kind of have to run away and get a bunch of space. I can generally maybe introduce my partner to my friends or family, express more positive feelings, less game playing, and I really like these last two. People who are lower on attachment, anxiety, and avoidance regulate their disclosures based on how much the other person is sharing. So if the other person is sharing more, they share more. If the other person is sharing less, they share less. This was like a note to myself, note to self, don't overshare, if the other person isn't sharing that much. And people who are lower on avoidance and anxiety kind of manage to strike that balance a little bit between independence and dependence, which is super hard. That need for separateness and togetherness in dating relationships is a big challenge. I think it's one of the number one challenges of dating relationships, right? But people who have less avoidance and anxiety kind of do a better job at that. Okay, so then if we just quickly talk about what this means when you've been with someone for longer, when you're past dating and you're in a more established relationship. I think this should sound like it makes sense based on what you've heard already. The people who are lower on avoidance and anxiety generally can express their emotions. They can hang in there with their partner's negative emotions, even though that's hard for all of us. So they can be comforting. They can seek support. They can generally give their partners more the benefit of the doubt. If you're cranky or distracted, that doesn't mean you don't love me, right? Or you're not into me. I can kind of give you, assume, the best here. If we're higher on avoidance, right, then we generally don't seek as much support when we're upset. And we have a harder time providing support when our partners are upset, and we tend to kind of minimize, right, and we tend to focus on tasks. So I already told you that I'm more on the anxious side, which is coming. So when I'm upset, everybody knows I'm upset in my house. My husband knows I'm upset. My kids are upset. Kids know. Everybody knows I'm upset. My husband's higher on avoidance. He could be really upset, and you would not know. And in fact, a frequent thing that he might say is it's like Wednesday or Thursday, and he'll say, on Monday, I was really upset about such and such. And I'm like, what? I didn't even know you were upset. And why on Monday did you not tell me, that you were upset? Why is it now Wednesday or Thursday and you're telling me you're upset? Because how he's learned to cope with difficult emotion is just to kind of put it away, like ignore it, kind of push it down for a little while, maybe, focus on tasks, retreat into other things, and then it takes a while for him to kind of realize that he was upset, maybe, and begin to talk about it. And then, so the higher anxiety, I mentioned that already, right? We amp up, and we are more demanding about wanting support and getting our needs met. And we are kind of like, oh my gosh, I looked out the window and you were grinning at our neighbor with this most beautiful smile, and I can't remember the last time you grinned at me like that, so what's that mean? Or in the case of my husband, you're super excited about this mountain biking race and this trail running race. You are so excited, and I cannot remember the last time you were that excited about me. What's this mean, right? That kind of stuff. Okay, and then sometimes we are higher on both. I mean, we all have some anxiety and avoidance, but sometimes we've got more of both of these. And this is often when the people that we were supposed to be able to trust early on in our lives weren't that trustworthy. So we're in this difficult position of really longing for connection, but feeling like connection isn't that safe. And so we can do this kind of move towards and then move away, right? This kind of back and forth. Okay, so I think this might be one of my last cahoots. When you're in distress, I'll get it up here. Do you tend to move towards more avoidance or more anxiety? Do you kind of shut down or amp up? Okay, so what we've got is about 40% of the class is saying more anxiety, about 30% is saying both, 20% is saying more avoidance, and about 7% is saying these just don't quite fit. It's something a little bit different. Okay, nice. So now it's good information to know you're not alone in your experiences. We've all got this. Okay, so now I'm going to kind of talk about how this ties into common patterns of conflict in relationships. And two patterns that we often talk about are pursue-withdraw or demand-withdraw, or what's called the seeker-sought. So think about seeker-sought, right, and think about Elsa and Anna. Who's the seeker? Who's the sought? Anna's the seeker. Elsa's the sought, right? Okay, so Anna's doing more pursuing, right? And Elsa's doing more distancing. And these patterns just emerge naturally in our relationships. I've got them in my marriage, in my friendship. Some friends I'm the seeker, some friends I'm the sought, right? These kind of emerge in all of our relationships. What attachment research would suggest is that people who have higher attachment-related anxiety than the other person are more likely to end up in that pursue or seeker relationship, and people who have higher attachment-related avoidance than the other person might be more likely to end up in that sought or withdraw kind of position. And when I used to run workshops for couples, I would give them like the measures that you did of attachment style, and then we'd compare their scores, and so you can kind of see what position you might end up falling into, right? And I could be the pursuer in one relationship because I'm more anxious than my husband, for example, but maybe if I was partnered with somebody else who was even more anxious in their attachment than me, maybe I would look more like the withdrawer, right, or the sought. Or it could shift in the same relationship over time. So here's kind of seeker-sought, right? I need space. I brought you roses. I really need space. I love you so much, right? And the more the sought moves away, the more the seeker wants to chase after them, right? And the more the seeker chases after them, the more the sought is like, I'm freaking out here, back off, right? I'm getting smothered, right? So it's a pattern that ends up exacerbating itself. And then that's often maybe more in the early parts of relationships. And then what it can often translate to into more established relationships, it's more of a critical pursuer and kind of defensive shutdown withdrawer. And so like if we imagine this is a cycle with Sally and Nancy, Sally is like, Nancy's gone all the time, she's working all the time, she doesn't care about me. And so she gets, when Nancy comes home, she's more like cranky or irritable, or he criticizes her, you're not here, you're not, doing what you're supposed to be doing here at home. Nancy's like, I'm working, I'm sorry, she's kind of defending herself, it's not that big of a deal, right? She tries to push it down. As soon as somebody starts pushing something down, what's the other person want to do? Intensify, kind of bring it back up. This is a big deal, right? So Sally starts making her case louder. Nancy gets overwhelmed by this. She starts to feel like whatever she's saying is making it worse. That's a hallmark of somebody in the more avoidant, withdrawn position. Whatever I'm saying is making it worse, so I might as well stop saying anything, and I'm just going to be quiet, right, and shut down. And so then it keeps going, right? She's detached, she disengages, and Sally still feels like Nancy doesn't care, right? So the one thing that I'm hoping that you'll kind of take away from this little slide is that a lot of times people think that they're fighting about some sort of content. They're fighting about chores, or they're fighting about where they're going to eat, or they're fighting about where they're going to go on vacation, or something like that. But what they're often fighting about is an underlying sense of, do you see me? Do you value me? Do you need me? Right? And as long as you've got this kind of fear that the other person doesn't get you, see you, value you, then it's very hard to resolve conflicts, because it always becomes about this other thing, right? So sometimes my husband and I can just be arguing about chores, but if he's feeling like, he hasn't been listened to, or, I'm not that connected to him, or I'm not that available for him, or vice versa, then our fight can start to devolve into this other, thing, which is more like, do you care about me? Do you care, right? Okay, so that's pursue withdraw patterns, and we tend to get stuck in them, and we tend to kind of repeat them over and over. And so one of the strategies that I'm going to talk to you about is starting to think about what your pattern is if you're in a relationship, and begin to articulate that with your partner. Like, there's this way that I kind of amp up, and then you tamp down, and then I amps up some more, and we kind of get stuck kind of going around and around. Okay, so a few slides here about attachment and sexuality. So attachment insecurity in general, whether it's anxiety or avoidance, is associated with basically not as much positive emotion about sex or during sex, feeling more stressed about sex, not being as turned on during sex, not feeling as good about yourself sexually, less likely to talk about your sexual needs with your partner or safety, and less safe sex, more substance use, kind of as a way to, kind of manage your anxiety. And for females, it's more risk of being sexually coerced, and for males, more in general, more risk of being sexually coercive. Those are just generalizations. So that kind of tells us why, another reason why it's a good idea to try to figure out this attachment thing, right? Because it has implications for our sexuality too. If we look more specifically at avoidance and anxiety, when we're higher on avoidance, we can have more positive feelings about casual sex, right? Because it doesn't involve as much commitment, it's not as much emotional vulnerability, so that feels good. We might be using sex more to feel good about ourselves, like self-worth, or to relieve our stress. And we're not really thinking that sex and love are the same thing. And when we're higher on attachment-related anxiety, we might have mixed feelings about casual sex. On the one hand, it might help us connect with other people, but on the other hand, maybe we don't feel so great about it afterwards if they're not that into us. And so we might be more at risk of having sex to try to bring someone else to us, please them, kind of connect with them. And we might be more likely to think that sex and love are the same thing. So that's really fast about sexuality. So now I want to just talk for a few minutes about strategies to create secure romantic attachments here at the end. So I'm going to give you some individual strategies, and then some in general, some specific to anxious and avoidant, and then just some general couple strategies, and then we'll be done. Okay, so the first one is, like we've already been talking about, first strategy is understanding your attachment style, taking tests like you are, kind of getting a sense of how you developed this, you know. The other part is, of course, not feeling like there's something wrong with you, knowing that you're normal and lots of other people struggle too. What I also recommend is going back to that idea of internal working model of self and other. Pay attention to that. Pay attention to how you're feeling about yourself and how you're feeling about your potential romantic partner, and get a sense of when you get triggered. When do you suddenly not so feel so great about yourself, or when do you not feel like you can rely on your romantic partner? Kind of what's going on for you there. We talk about kind of emotional intelligence in general in our society, and a lot of attachment is about naming more vulnerable emotions and fears, right? So learning to kind of be able to talk about that idea of you can name it to tame it, and that's a whole nother, you know, area we could be talking about. Notice what attachment styles in others you tend to gravitate towards. So what I noticed is that as somebody who tends to be more on attachment-related anxiety, I'm always picking people in friends or partners who are more attachment-related avoidant, who are more avoidant. And the way I make sense of that is that I'm overwhelming myself all the time, and so I'd rather be with someone who doesn't overwhelm me, right, with kind of maximizing their distress. But I pick people who are avoidant, and then I get mad at them for being avoidant, right? And so I had to kind of be aware, like, I chose you, you help me feel more calm, but then sometimes it pisses me off that you hold everything in, you know, and I get critical about it. And then, of course, the more you can talk, the more you can do things like this. Come here, talk to your partner, talk to family, talk to friends, you know, or have a therapist. The more you process this kind of stuff, the more you have kind of more success in attachment. Okay, so if you are higher on attachment-related anxiety, here's kind of some things to kind of notice about yourself. So notice if you start kind of jumping to conclusions that they're just not that into you, or, you know, they're something like that, right? Or you're wanting to be kind of reactive or manipulative. You basically want to kind of check yourself, right? Slow yourself down a little bit. You also want to check yourself when you're ruminating a ton, just thinking about your partner all the time or idealizing them, right? That's also a sign that you're maybe into more of your attachment-related anxiety. Of course, when you're starting to get desperate, right? And I have been in this place of texting kind of and waiting for a response and checking, right? That's just kind of a little bit of a red flag that we might need to kind of, you know, calm our attachment-related anxiety. Thinking that this is it, like if this relationship ends, my future is over, right? So kind of having that sense of desperation, staying even though you're miserable, and letting yourself kind of ride that emotional roller coaster. So these are all things we have to kind of just watch ourselves on, right? These are our red flags. If we're more avoidant, we might fall into traps of thinking, oh, our partner's being too needy. We might be doing like thinking of small imperfections as a way to distance. So, you know, I was really attracted to you, but now you cut your hair, and I'm sorry, I'm just not attracted to you anymore, right? You know, or something like that, right? Like, just kind of distance away. Pulling away when the relationship is actually going well. I can relate to this one, even though I'm not more avoidant, but when getting nervous about closeness, and so instead kind of pining or fantasizing about somebody that's unavailable rather than the person that's in front of you, right, as a way to kind of distance a little bit. You want to check yourself here if you find yourself flirting with other people, zoning out when your partner is trying to talk to you, when you're starting to kind of hold a lot of things in and not commit, you know, to any future activities. And I found this strategy super helpful for people who are higher on avoidance, but for all of us, which is using activities as a way to let down your guard. So if I'm got more attachment-related avoidance, then like sitting down to dinner with you and like, you know, doing a heart-to-heart where we stare into each other's eyes, that may just kind of actually freak me out. You know, that's not maybe what I want to do. But if we went on a bike ride together and we're next to each other, then I can kind of let down my guard a little bit more, right? So just noticing if that's a way that you feel more comfortable. That's probably why a lot of us confess things in dark cars, you know, because it's just a little bit of a little safe, you know, distancing, right? Okay. And so then couple strategies are first to just realize that if you're kind of you've been with this person for a little while, they're starting to become an attachment figure for you and vice versa. And there is nothing wrong with that. We don't like the way it makes us feel because it makes us feel kind of vulnerable or weak to need other people, but we all do need other people. There's just nothing wrong with us in that. I'll just tell you when my aha moment was for that. It actually wasn't in relation to my husband. It was right after I had given birth to my first baby, and I was 30, right? But all of a sudden I was having this big need for connection with my mom. I wanted to talk to my mom on the phone. I wanted my mom to come to visit. I was feeling like this big urge to connect with my mom. And I was basically thinking, like, what's wrong with me, right? I'm happily married. I'm 30. Like, I shouldn't be needing my mom so much. There's something wrong with me. And so I was in graduate school, and I was taking a class on attachment. And I was driving back late at night, right, in the car with my professor who was teaching this class. We had been doing this intervention, and we were driving back together, 9 o'clock at night in the dark. And I confessed, Margaret, I think there's something wrong with me. I just feel like I'm needing my mom too much, right? And in that moment, Margaret said, Ashley, we all need other people. And I just felt like this huge weight come off my shoulder. There is nothing wrong with me, like, for needing somebody. And in fact, now that I understand attachment more, during times of transition, right, or stress, when we feel more vulnerable in the world, our attachment needs go up, right? That's when we start kind of turning to our people and kind of needing more from them. There's nothing wrong with needing other people. The second thing would be trying to pay attention to that seek or sought or pursue withdraw pattern and realize that it might be something that you're getting stuck in and kind of polarized in. And how can you start to, the first thing is just to name it. Oh, we did that thing again where I get really critical and you defend and shut down and then I come after you some more and you pull away. We did that, right? You oftentimes reflect on it after it happens for a while, and then at some point you catch yourself while you're in it, right? And you begin to shift that. And once you begin to understand your partner's kind of attachment fears and needs, then that begins to shift your dynamics. So just a really quick early story about my husband and I. We were in therapy when I was 22, he was 23. We had just graduated. We were going to therapy here at the CSU Center for Family and Couple Therapy. We had moved out here. And I remember this moment in therapy. We were doing this odd therapy that doesn't get practiced anymore, where you had to stand on little mats and talk about, like, this is my rational thinking, this is my emotional thinking, you had to do this about an issue, so he's standing on his mat and I'm standing on my mat. Whatever it was we were discussing, and we got to this moment where the therapist said, where Jordan started to realize, like, when you get mad at me, it triggers some fear in me, and we're trying to kind of unpack that. And basically what Jordan said is, when you get mad at me, it makes me afraid you're going to leave me. And what it reminds me of is the day that my dad told us that he and my mom were getting divorced, and he wasn't going to live with us anymore, and he drove off. Like, that's what gets triggered for me when you start to get mad at me, right? And that moment of knowing that about Jordan's kind of attachment needs and vulnerability, that changed our relationship forever, right? Because now when I start to, like, amp up like I do, I'm getting madder, and I see his little face go flat, right, and quiet, I don't think, oh, he just doesn't care. I think he's getting triggered. Like, this is where he thinks he's not good enough for me, and I'm going to leave him, and he's getting that fear of abandonment, and that helps me come back down, right? And then I repair. It's not that big of a deal. It's okay. I'm sorry. Let me go for a run. Let me have a cup of coffee. Let me get some protein. Then we can try this again, right? I can kind of bring it back down because I understand his vulnerabilities. Okay. And then the last little bit here about strategies is you could do some sort of thinking like this, and this is what we often have couples do in workshops, is when we're not getting along, this is how I react, this is how my partner reacts, this is how I feel, this is how I imagine they feel. Like, trying to get a sense of that cycle or pattern. Okay, we are almost here at the end. So I want to give you a couple of additional resources if you were interested in this. So I have for several years now, we have had some honors students in HDFS basically curating this blog called Help Me, I'm Lovesick, and it's all about how attachment relates to issues in our romantic relationships. It can be about daddy issues, it's about casual sex, it's about substance use, it's about long-distance relationships, it's about social media and attachment, and so I would encourage you to check it out if you're interested. They're really well, everybody who posts does some research on the issue and interviews people about the issue and then puts it together in a post, so it's pretty cool. And then this is the book that I pulled stuff from this book for this presentation, and this is the book that I most recommend for people in kind of younger relationships, is this book, Attached, and gives more kind of insight into dating and attachment styles and relationship formation. So I don't know if everybody got a handout of the PowerPoint slides. If you didn't and you would like kind of a PDF of the slides, you can just Google me on CSU and send me an email, and I'd be happy to send you a PDF if you didn't get it. Do you want to, so I want to think about our time. I can open it up to some large group questions, see if there's anything you want to kind of talk about, and we can talk about as a large group, and then I can also hang around and answer questions more one-on-one. Anybody got large group questions you want to kind of bring up? Because that was, just a short amount of information. It's a whole big area, but. Okay, how about this? Before we go, maybe just turn to the person next to you and say what you think you're most likely to remember from what you heard today. How about that? Okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah.